Istanbul, March 1882. Alex Baltazzi walks out of a building on the Galata waterfront that his family has occupied for 3 generations. He is not walking out by choice. The Baltazzi family had financed Ottoman sultans since the 1850s. They had extended credit when European banks would not. They had structured bonds, absorbed sovereign risk, and made the Ottoman state liquid when its treasury ran dry. They were, in Baltazzi's own words, the men who prolonged the life of the Ottomans. And now they were broke. Not because they had made bad bets, not because they had been reckless, because the state they had sustained for 3 decades had been handed, structurally, institutionally, legally, to a different creditor class, a European one. And that class had no use for the Galata bankers. What happened in Istanbul between 1875 and 1881 is taught in financial history courses as a model of sovereign debt restructuring. The Ottoman Empire had borrowed heavily from European markets in the 1850s and 1860s to finance the Crimean War and a cascade of modernization projects that never generated the revenues projected to service them. By 1875, the treasury was running at roughly 30% of debt service capacity. In October of that year, Grand Vizier Mahmud Nadim Pasha announced that the empire would pay only half its interest obligations. That is the official entry point. A government runs out of money. It defaults. Creditors negotiate. A restructuring body is established. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration, the OPDA, was created by the Muharrem Decree in December 1881. It is cited in Cambridge Financial Histories as a sophisticated creditor-debtor resolution mechanism. The 2021 paper in the British Journal for the History of Science describes it differently. It describes it as a tax farm. To understand what a tax farm actually is, you need to go back further than 1881. Tax farming, the practice of selling the right to collect taxes to a private party, is one of the oldest mechanisms of extractive governance on record. Rome did it. The French monarchy did it. The Qing dynasty did it. The logic is simple. A government that cannot efficiently collect its own revenue sells that right to someone who can, in exchange for an upfront payment or an ongoing cut. What the Muharrem Decree did was structurally identical. The Ottoman state ceded direct collection rights over specific revenue streams to the OPDA. Those streams included the salt and tobacco monopolies, stamp duties, fishing license revenues, silk tithe collections from Bulgaria and Eastern Rumelia, and tribute payments from Cyprus and other surrendered territories. The OPDA was not a foreign institution staffed by foreigners sitting in a building in Paris. It was staffed primarily by Ottoman subjects. It operated inside Ottoman territory. It collected taxes from Ottoman citizens, but it was governed by a council of 7 delegates, one each from the British, Dutch, French, German, Austro-Hungarian, Italian, and Ottoman bondholder groups, with the Ottoman representative holding exactly 1 vote in 7. The revenues it collected did not pass through the Ottoman treasury. They flowed directly to European bondholders. This is not a contested interpretation. This is in the decree. By 1914, the OPDA was collecting approximately 30% of all Ottoman government revenues. Let that number land. Not a portion of external debt payments. Not a financial transfer negotiated between state entities. 30% of all domestic government revenues. Collected inside Ottoman territory, administered by an institution controlled by foreign creditors, disbursed to those creditors before the Ottoman state saw a single piastre. The Cambridge paper. Impossible to provide an accurate estimate. The interested calculation of the Ottoman public debt, 1875 to 1881. Documents in granular detail how the debt figures themselves were constructed. The methodology used by European creditors to calculate the outstanding obligation was not neutral accounting. It was, in the paper's own language, interested calculation, meaning the numbers were produced by the parties who stood to benefit from higher totals. This is significant, not because it proves fraud in a criminal sense, but because it establishes that the foundational document of the restructuring, the agreed debt figure, was produced by institutions with a direct financial interest in maximizing it. The restructuring's legitimacy rested entirely on the debt being what the creditors said it was. The creditors calculated the debt. The Galata bankers are a useful lens here because they complicate the clean narrative in 2 directions. They were not European. They were Ottoman subjects. Greek, Armenian, and Jewish merchant banking families who had operated in Istanbul for centuries and who had served as the primary domestic credit intermediaries for the Ottoman state. The Commando family, the Baltazzi family, the Tubini family. These were not outsiders extracting value from the empire. They were structurally embedded in it. They had also, by the 1870s, become deeply exposed to Ottoman sovereign debt, not through naivety, but through decades of relationship-based lending that made them, in effect, the empire's first creditors of last resort. When the OPDA was established and the restructuring terms were set, the Galata bankers were not given preferential treatment because of their historical role. They were treated as a subordinate creditor class. The 2021 ResearchGate paper on the Baltazzi family, drawing on family correspondence and Ottoman financial records, documents the outcome directly. Alex Baltazzi's statement, preserved in those records, is one of the most precise descriptions of institutional displacement in the financial historical archive. The Galata bankers prolonged the life of the Ottomans. As it collapsed, they collapsed, not as speculators who had misjudged a bet, as creditors who had sustained an institution that was subsequently restructured in a way that systematically advantaged external bondholders over domestic ones. Now consider where the actual costs landed. European bondholders took a haircut on face value, roughly 36% in the initial restructuring. This is the number cited in mainstream financial histories as evidence of creditor sacrifice. What those histories do not foreground is where the replacement revenue came from: the OPDA's collection apparatus. The salt monopoly, the tobacco monopoly, the silk tithe was not extracting value from the Ottoman elite, who had accumulated the debt over 2 decades of infrastructure borrowing. It was extracting value from Ottoman agricultural workers paying tobacco levies, from fishing communities paying licensing fees, from silk producers in the Balkans paying tithe percentages on their harvest. The debt had been contracted by a narrow Ottoman administrative and political class, making decisions about rail contracts and military procurement. The service costs were collected from an entirely different population, one that had no representation in the debt contracting decisions and no seat at the restructuring table. This is not incidental, it is structural, and it was not unique to the Ottomans. In 1902, Venezuela defaulted on sovereign obligations to British, German, and Italian creditors. The creditors dispatched warships to blockade Venezuelan ports. The resulting arbitration at the Hague Tribunal of 1903 ruled that creditors who had used force to enforce claims were entitled to priority repayment over creditors who had not. The precedent was precise. Creditors who threatened military action secured better terms than creditors who waited. The lesson absorbed by the global creditor class was not subtle. Sovereign debt enforcement was not purely a legal mechanism. It was a power mechanism, and the Ottoman case had already demonstrated that institutional enforcement, a permanent administrative body with collection authority, could achieve the same extraction that warships achieved for Venezuela at lower political cost and with greater long-term stability. Greece, 1898. Following its defeat in the Greco-Turkish War of 1897 and the economic collapse that followed, Greece accepted the establishment of the International Financial Commission, a body almost structurally identical to the OPDA. It took control of revenues from the Greek salt, petroleum, tobacco, and match monopolies, along with customs duties from the port of Piraeus. The IFC operated until 1978. Not until Greece paid off its debts. Not until the economy recovered. Until 1978, 80 years after its establishment. For 80 years, a portion of Greek customs and monopoly revenues flowed to a creditor-controlled body before they reached the Greek state. Egypt provides the third data point. The Caisse de la Dette Publique. Established in 1876, 1 year after Egypt's Khedive Ismail suspended debt payments, operated a dual controller system in which British and French commissioners held veto power over Egyptian budget decisions. This led directly to the Urabi Revolt of 1882 and Britain's military occupation of Egypt, an occupation that lasted until 1954. Egypt entered a debt restructuring in 1876. It exited British military occupation in 1954. The causal chain is not linear, but the institutional sequence is documented. Creditor control of sovereign revenues, then political instability, then military intervention, then occupation. The Ottoman case compressed this sequence into a slower, more bureaucratic form. The OPDA did not trigger an immediate military occupation. It achieved something the creditors arguably preferred: sustained extraction without the political costs of direct colonialism. The counterexample that financial historians prefer to cite is Austria-Hungary's 1868 debt restructuring, a case in which a defaulting sovereign negotiated with creditors, accepted oversight conditions, and returned to market access within a decade without surrendering domestic collection authority. The Austro-Hungarian case is instructive precisely because it contrasts with the Ottoman one. Vienna retained control of its revenue collection apparatus. The oversight body was advisory, not administrative. And critically, the restructuring terms were negotiated between parties with roughly comparable institutional and legal standing. The Ottoman Empire did not have comparable standing in 1881. It was recovering from the catastrophic Treaty of Berlin in 1878, a settlement in which it had lost Bulgaria, Bosnia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Romania in the space of 2 years. Its administrative capacity was severely degraded. Its political leadership was internally fractured. The creditors negotiated the Muharrem Decree with a counterpart that was, in structural terms, unable to refuse. This is what distinguishes the OPDA from a standard restructuring mechanism. It was not a bilateral negotiation between sovereign equals. It was a term-setting process imposed on a state that had already lost the capacity to enforce an alternative. In April 2022, Sri Lanka's central bank governor announced the country's first sovereign default since independence. The subsequent negotiations produced a restructuring described in mainstream financial coverage as an orderly resolution process. The forensic record is more specific. The Hambantota port, built with Chinese financing, had already been transferred to a Chinese state enterprise on a 99-year lease in 2017, not as a restructuring condition, but as a bilateral deal executed while Sri Lanka was still current on its debt service obligations. The transfer predated the default. The lease ran for 99 years. The post-2022 IMF program added a second layer. The agreement included conditions governing tax revenue mobilization, with specific targets tied to export processing zone revenues and excise collections. Revenue streams that would, under the program's terms, be monitored and partially ring-fenced for debt service. The structural parallel to the Muharrem Decree is not metaphorical. It is institutional. Specific revenue streams identified. Collection conditions attached. External monitoring of domestic fiscal performance embedded in the legal architecture of the restructuring agreement. The Ottoman Empire signed the Muharrem Decree in December 1881. Sri Lanka signed its IMF program in March 2023. The institutional logic is 142 years old. Here is what the forensic record requires you to do with this information. The OPDA is not an aberration. It is a template. The conditions under which it operates. Sovereign fiscal stress. External creditor concentration. Asymmetric negotiating capacity. Revenue-specific collection rights are not historically unusual. They are the standard conditions of sovereign debt crises. The question is not whether this mechanism exists. The question is where you sit in relation to it. The Galata bankers sat at the center of the Ottoman financial system. They had relationships, institutional knowledge, and decades of embedded credibility. They were also subordinate creditors in a restructuring designed by and for a different class. Their proximity to the system was not a shield. It was an exposure. The Ottoman agricultural worker paying the tobacco tithe sat at the base of the system. He had no knowledge of the Muharrem Decree, no representation in the negotiation, no mechanism for exit. He simply paid. The historical record does not offer many examples of individuals who were neither the creditor class nor the extracted class in these cycles. But the ones it does offer share a specific characteristic. They held assets the collection apparatus could not easily reach, physical commodities outside the financial system, productive land not denominated in the currency being depreciated, claims on assets and jurisdictions outside the restructuring perimeter. Not because they predicted the crisis, because they had structured their holdings for the possibility of it. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse in a day. It contracted over 40 years. The OPDA ran from 1881 to 1914, 33 years of structured extraction before the First World War dissolved the institutional framework entirely. During those 33 years, the empire continued to function. Businesses operated. Families built wealth. The social fabric did not tear. What changed was the direction of value flow. Revenue that had previously cycled through the Ottoman state into Ottoman institutions now flowed outward to bondholders in London, Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, before it ever reached a domestic institution. The individuals who preserved capital across that period were not those who had predicted the collapse. They were those who had already made themselves partly external to the system before the collection apparatus was formalized. Alex Baltazzi did not do that. He was too embedded. His entire value proposition depended on the system he served remaining intact. The system did not remain intact. The pattern is not a conspiracy. It is a logic. Sovereigns borrow to solve fiscal problems they cannot otherwise solve. Creditors lend at the price of structural access. When the debt becomes unserviceable, the restructuring converts that access into institutional authority. Collection rights flow outward. The middle pays. This happened in the Ottoman Empire, in Greece, in Egypt, in Venezuela, in Argentina, in Sri Lanka. The mechanism does not require malicious actors. It requires only the standard incentive structure of creditor-sovereign relations under fiscal stress. Understanding that mechanism is not pessimism. It is literacy. The Baltazzi family understood the Ottoman financial system better than almost anyone alive in 1875. That understanding did not protect them. What they lacked was distance. If you found this analysis useful, the work continues in the next video.